The dust settled over the ridgeline as the last trace of twilight bled into darkness. In the valley below, the SEAL team of 9 lay entrenched in the jagged outcrop of stone that had become their desperate fortress. Their mission had been simple on paper: exfiltrate a captured CIA asset from a mountain village straddling the border between hostile territories. But as always in war, the paper burned quickly in the fire of reality. The extraction bird never came, the village erupted into chaos. By the time they fought their way out, the hills around them had swarmed with insurgents. 20 men against 9 would already have been a knife fight. But Twentyfold meant they were now staring down nearly 200 enemies, pouring from the ridges, screaming into radios, lighting the night with tracer fire. Survival wasn't in the odds, it was in their will. And that will rested on one person, their sniper, Lieutenant Kara Hawkeye Dalton. Kara lay prone at the highest point of the outcrop, her cheek welded to the stock of her suppressed Mk-13 sniper rifle. The weapon was nearly an extension of her body, each bolt-action movement as natural as breath. The night vision optics painted the world in shades of green. The glass she saw them, shadows darting, rifles raised, eyes hungry. The men around her had no illusions. Without her they would be flanked, overrun, and annihilated. But as long as she could see, as long as she could fire, their perimeter held. Her voice, calm and razor-sharp over comms, cut through the cacophony. Left boulder. 3 hostiles advancing. I've got them. A breath, a squeeze, the dull pop of the suppressed shot, and 3 green silhouettes folded into the dirt. The valley roared back with gunfire, bullets ricocheting against stone, sparks spitting into the night. Chief Petty Officer Ramirez, the team leader, crawled beside her, blood already seeping from a grazing wound on his arm. He didn't flinch. You keep painting Dalton. We'll keep holding the line. No one gets past us tonight. He slid back down to the lower ledge, rallying the others, their silhouettes crouched behind rocks and the shattered husk of an old cart they had turned into makeshift cover. Each SEAL fired in controlled bursts, disciplined, professional, their rounds finding targets even as the enemy tried to surge forward. But there were always more. For every body that hit the dirt, 2 more seemed to emerge from the black. They were fighting a tide, and it was only her accuracy that turned the tide into a trickle. Kara's breathing was steady, but inside her chest, her heart pounded like a drum of war. Not fear, never fear, but a pounding awareness of the stakes. Every time her finger pressed the trigger, it wasn't just a kill shot, it was another heartbeat for her brothers. She adjusted her scope, caught movement on the far ridge, an RPG team setting up, their silhouettes fumbling with the launcher. If they fired, her whole team would be vaporized in seconds. Her lips barely parted as she held her breath, and in one clean shot the man's head snapped back, his body crumpling as the launcher slipped uselessly into the dirt. His partner scrambled, panicked, but her second shot silenced him before he even realized where death had come from. Down below, one of the SEALs roared in triumph. That's 2 saves for Hawkeye. The enemy shifted tactics. Suppressive fire raked the rocks, a storm of lead forcing the SEALs to hug the dirt. Grenades lobbed overhead, exploding against the stone, shaking the earth. One landed dangerously close, its blast throwing Petty Officer Givens against the rocks. He staggered back up, dazed, bleeding from his forehead but still gripping his weapon. Kara's eyes burned, her vision tunneling into the scope. She could not blink, could not fall. Every flash of muzzle on the horizon was a target. She worked the bolt, fired, worked it again, the rifle's rhythm syncing with her breath. One enemy dropped mid-sprint. Another collapsed as he tried to toss a grenade. A third, crouched behind a tree, thought himself hidden until her bullet tore through bark and bone alike. She was their ghost in the darkness, the reaper they never saw, and for every soul she claimed, her brothers drew another breath. But the numbers were pressing in. Ramirez called over comms, his voice ironclad but edged with urgency. Ammo check. We're burning fast. The responses came one by one, half mags, quarter mags, some already down to their last grenades. They weren't going to last the night on bullets alone. Kara knew it, Ramirez knew it, they all knew it. Yet she let this go. Then every shot counts, she said flatly, her eyes never leaving the scope. She shifted, tracking another advancing squad. A trigger pull, a body dropped. She adjusted for wind, another shot, another kill. It wasn't enough to win, but it was enough to hold. And holding was survival. As midnight deepened, the world narrowed to fire, blood, and steel. The insurgents howled with fury, frustrated by invisible death, but their numbers pressed closer. The SEAL's position was scarred with bullet holes, splintered rock, and the stench of burned powder. Yet in the chaos, Kara remained steady. Her rifle cracked again and again, and with each enemy that fell, she carved hope out of hopelessness. The men whispered her call sign like a prayer, like a promise, that as long as Hawkeye breathed, they still had a fighting chance. The night stretched into a brutal eternity, every second hammered by gunfire, every breath choked with dust and cordite. The SEALs were bleeding, battered, but not broken. The jagged outcrop they had claimed for cover had become both their sanctuary and their coffin in waiting, and the only thing keeping it from tipping toward the ladder was the unflinching eye of Lieutenant Kara Hawkeye Dalton. She had become more than their sniper, she was the hinge of fate upon which all of them swung. Her scope swept the darkness in tireless arcs, her mind cataloging every flash of light, every movement in the shadows. The world through her glass was reduced to geometry and timing, wind, range, breath, squeeze. Life and death were nothing more than equations solved at 1,200 meters per second. But the enemy was learning. Their first assaults had been wild, waves of screaming zealotry charging uphill into her crosshairs. That had been their mistake, and they had paid for it with piles of bodies scattered across the valley floor. Now they were slower, smarter, spreading out, coordinating suppressive fire, probing for weak spots in the SEAL perimeter. Kara could feel it, the rhythm of the battle shifting, tightening around them like a noose. A sudden burst of automatic fire stitched across her position, rounds sparking against the rock inches from her face. She rolled, adjusted, sighted the shooter. One pull of the trigger and he dropped behind his own muzzle flash. She didn't exhale until she chambered the next round. Her hands were steady, but the truth clawed at her. Even her accuracy couldn't kill time. Sooner or later, numbers would crush them. Down barked orders with iron steadiness, his voice carrying even through the chaos. Hold fire until they're in range. Conserve your ammo. Givens, cover the west flank. Myers, check that wounded. The men moved like a single body, trained instincts overriding exhaustion. Their silhouettes shifted, firing in controlled bursts, every round spent with purpose. Still, Kara heard the ragged edge in their breaths, saw the red stains spreading across their uniforms. They were warriors, yes, but they were still human, and humans bled. Humans died. She forced the thought away, tightening her focus. Contact East Ridge, 3 targets moving low, she called over comms. She marked them with her shots, 3 cracks, 3 collapses, and the threat evaporated. Her brothers didn't even look up to thank her. They trusted her implicitly, the same way they trusted the rifles in their hands. An hour crawled past, then another. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and indifferent, as if mocking the fury unfolding beneath them. Kara's cheek ached from being pressed against the rifle stock for so long, her muscles screamed from the tension of stillness, but she did not yield. Her kill count had blurred into a grim haze. 30? 40? She had stopped keeping track when her hands first trembled, when she realized tallying numbers didn't matter. What mattered was the men at her back. What mattered was seeing the dawn. She adjusted her scope again and froze. Through the green haze she spotted them, heavy weapons. A crew was dragging a mounted machine gun into position on the far ridge, shielded by their comrades' suppressive fire. If they set it up, the SEAL's cover would turn into a death trap in seconds. Kara, talk to me. Ramirez shouted over comms, hearing the urgency in her silence. She didn't answer. She simply shifted her scope, drew a bead on the gunner and pulled the trigger. The man's head snapped back, his body collapsing over the weapon. His partner scrambled to take his place, but she was already cycling the bolt, the reticle finding him before he even reached the grip. Another shot, another fall. The third man hesitated, panicked, fumbling for the gun. Her third shot silenced him too. The weapon lay abandoned, harmless. She exhaled slowly, only now realizing she had been holding her breath through all 3 kills. Ramirez's voice came again, grim but alive. That's why you're Hawkeye. Keep doing God's work. The valley answered back with fury. The insurgents unleashed another wave, this one accompanied by mortars. The first round landed wide, the explosion lighting up the mountainside. The second landed closer, shaking the outcrop with a thunderous blast, showering the team with rocks and dirt. Kara's ears rang, but she forced her focus through it. Mortars meant coordinates. Mortars meant someone was spotting them. She swept her scope, searching, and found him. A man on the far ridge, radio pressed to his mouth, arm raised to correct fire. Her shot took him clean through the chest, his radio clattering into the dirt. The mortars faltered, then ceased. The team roared approval, but Kara didn't allow herself the luxury of pride. Each victory was temporary. Each reprieve was just a before the hammer fell again minutes later. Enemy forces surged from the north, dozens of silhouettes scrambling across the rocks. Ramirez shouted, "All guns north. Light them up." The SEALs unleashed their rifles, grenades exploding, tracer rounds cutting arcs of light into the darkness. Kara switched positions, dragging her rifle to a higher angle, picking off the lead runners one by one. Her shots carved holes in the charge, slowing it, breaking its rhythm. The insurgents faltered under the rain of lead, but sheer numbers pressed them forward. It was a meat grinder, brutal and relentless, and the SEALs were the teeth. But teeth dulled. Teeth broke. Kara could feel the grind wearing them down. Then came the voice in her ear, soft but unshakable, Ramirez's voice, the voice of a leader who knew the truth but refused to let it crush his men. "Dalton, listen. We're not making it out if this keeps up. They'll bury us here. But if anyone can buy us time, hell, if anyone can carve us a miracle, it's you. So don't you dare stop. You hear me?" Kara swallowed hard, her throat dry, her eyes burning against the scope. She didn't answer with words. Her answer was another shot and another and another. As long as she drew breath, her rifle spoke for her. The night had become a crucible of fire and steel, and the SEALs were being forged down to the barest essence of survival. Hours of relentless combat had stripped them of everything but grit and instinct. Their magazines ran dangerously low, their grenades nearly spent, their bodies screaming with exhaustion. And yet not a single man yielded. They fought because there was no other choice. They fought because Hawkeye's steady hand gave them reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could hold until dawn. Kara Dalton's world had narrowed to the cold steel of her rifle and the green glow of her scope. Every breath, every heartbeat, was tethered to the act of killing. The weight of her rifle no longer registered, the pain in her cheek from hours pressed against the stock forgotten. Only the math mattered, distance, wind, lead. But beneath the mechanical precision, something deeper burned. She wasn't just killing for survival, she was killing to keep her brothers alive. Each shot wasn't just an execution, it was a promise. Her finger curled around the trigger and another man fell. Promise kept. Again and again. But her ammunition was thinning, and the magazine clattered empty far too soon. She pulled a fresh one from her pouch, but the truth gnawed at her. There weren't enough magazines left to last the night. Ramirez crawled up beside her, face streaked with blood and dirt, one arm wrapped in a hastily tied bandage. He peered over the ridge, then ducked back, shaking his head. "They're not stopping. They want us buried here." His eyes met hers, steady and unyielding despite the chaos. "Dalton, when it comes down to it, you keep firing until that last round leaves the chamber. After that," he trailed off, but the meaning hung heavy between them. "After that, it was knives. It was fists. It was nothing but teeth and will." Kara nodded, no words wasted. She chambered another round, turned back to her scope and fired again. The insurgents surged once more, this time closer than ever. Muzzle flashes lit up the rocks as they fired from barely 50 meters out, their war cries echoing through the valley. The SEALs answered with controlled bursts, but their rate of fire had slowed, conserving every last bullet. Givens, wounded and half-blind from the blast earlier, still leaned against the rocks, his rifle spitting controlled fire. Myers crouched low, his side bleeding heavily, yet he still reloaded with practiced efficiency. These men were shadows of themselves now, pushed past exhaustion, yet their discipline held. And through it all, Kara's rifle cracked like thunder, breaking the charge piece by piece. Then from the north, a shadow loomed, an armored technical, headlights piercing through the smoke. Kara's heart slammed in her chest. She knew what that weapon could do to them, turn their cover into dust in seconds. She adjusted her scope, locked onto the gunner and squeezed. The man folded, collapsing against the mount. But another took his place instantly and another after him. She dropped them one by one, but the truck kept rolling closer, its steel hull shrugging off the rifle fire from below. Ramirez's voice cracked over comms. "We need that technical down or we're finished." Kara's eyes flicked to her last two magazines. She swallowed, adjusted her scope, and aimed for the driver through the windshield. The angle was bad, the glare of the headlights blinding, but she exhaled, steadied, and fired. The bullet punched through glass and the truck swerved violently, crashing into the rock. Flames erupted as its engine caught, the explosion lighting up the valley like false dawn. The blast hurled bodies aside, both enemy and rock alike, buying the SEALs a moment of reprieve. Cheers erupted behind her, but Kara didn't celebrate. Her gaze stayed locked on the horizon. For every victory, another wave was already building. As the smoke cleared, the insurgents regrouped, angered by the loss of their vehicle. They poured forward in greater numbers, filling the valley with their howls. The SEALs braced, every man down to his last handful of rounds. Kara ejected her magazine, slid in her second to last, and whispered under her breath, "Not yet. Not tonight." Her rifle barked again and bodies fell. But with each kill, she felt the weight of dwindling ammunition. A brutal close-range combat. Grenades burst among the rocks, and the enemy pressed within meters of their position. Ramirez drew his sidearm, firing at shadows scrambling over the ridge. Givens swung his rifle like a club when it clicked empty. Myers, bleeding out, still managed to lob his last grenade, sending 3 insurgents sprawling. The SEALs fought like cornered wolves, feral and desperate. Kara kept her scope trained, dropping enemies so close she could see the whites of their eyes. Her hands were blistered, her arms aching, but she didn't falter. Not when her brothers needed her most. Then finally it came, the hollow metallic click of an empty chamber. Kara ejected the magazine, found only one left in her pouch, and slammed it home. Her last 30 rounds. 30 heartbeats. 30 promises. She set her jaw, sighted another hostile, and fired. 30, she whispered. Another fell. 29. She cycled the bolt, fired again. The count echoed in her head, a grim mantra. With each shot, the number dwindled just as their chances did. But she would not stop. Not while breath filled her lungs. By the time her magazine was half spent, the enemy had pushed within throwing distance. Bullets whipped past her, ricocheting off stone, the air thick with smoke and screams. She dropped another man at point-blank range, then another. The magazine rattled light in her hand. 12 rounds left. She gritted her teeth, adjusted her scope, and whispered, "We hold." And somewhere in the distance, fire and wounded, Kara thought she heard it, the low thrum of helicopter blades. Or maybe it was just her heartbeat, desperate for hope. The ridge was a furnace of smoke and fire, the SEALs clinging to survival by shredded threads of willpower. Kara's rifle cracked until the bolt slammed empty, her last cartridge casing tumbling into the dirt. The silence of an empty chamber was deafening against the chaos. She dropped the rifle, drew her sidearm, and slid into position beside Ramirez. He gave her a look, grim and wordless, and she nodded. It was no longer about precision at distance. The fight had collapsed into blood and shadows within arm's reach. The insurgents poured up the rocks like a flood, their war cries mingling with the thunder of gunfire. SEALs met them head-on, steel against steel, lead against flesh. Petty Officer Givens swung the butt of his rifle into a man's face, the crunch of bone audible even over the noise. Myers, pale and bleeding heavily, fired his pistol with one hand while clutching his side with the other, every shot placed with the calm of a man who had trained for this moment his entire life. Ramirez bellowed orders that were half commands, half defiance, holding the line by force of will alone. Kara fired her pistol until the slide locked back, dropping enemies barely meters away. She reloaded with shaking hands, ejected the mag, slammed another home, and kept firing. She was no longer Hawkeye the sniper, she was simply Kara, fighting tooth and nail, every round keeping death one step further away from the men she refused to lose. Blood splattered her face, she didn't know whose. Her arms while they still drew breath. The insurgents' numbers seemed endless. They came over the rocks in 2s and 3s, then 10s, ducking into cover, firing wildly, trying to overwhelm by sheer force. Kara's shots dropped them in bursts, Ramirez's rifle barked beside her, and the others carved gaps in the tide. But gaps closed, and for every man they felled, 2 more took his place. The ridge ran slick with blood, the night alive with screams both human and inhuman. Then came the hand-to-hand. An insurgent lunged over the rock, blade flashing. Kara twisted, fired point-blank, the man collapsing across her. She shoved him aside just as another came, swinging the butt of his rifle. Ramirez intercepted, tackling the man to the ground, finishing him with a knife to the throat. Kara's pistol clicked empty again. She slammed in her last magazine without counting, knowing when it was gone she would be down to steel and fists. Her breath came ragged, smoke burning her lungs. Yet in the maelstrom she caught it again, that faint rhythmic thrum on the horizon. Helicopters. This time it wasn't her imagination. Over the roar of the battle the sound grew clearer. Kara's heart surged, but she crushed the hope before it could distract her. If reinforcements were coming they still had to survive long enough to see them. "Birds incoming," she shouted, voice cracking through comms. Hold the line. The SEALs rallied, every ounce of strength pouring into one last stand. Givens, bloodied and staggering, screamed curses as he cut down 2 more with his sidearm. Myers, on the edge of collapse, leaned against the rocks but kept firing. Ramirez emptied his last mag, dropped his rifle, drew his gun without hesitation. Kara's pistol barked until it went dry, then she too drew her blade. The fight became primal, grappling, slashing, smashing skulls against stone. The ridge was a slaughterhouse, but the SEALs fought like demons, refusing to yield. Overhead, the thrum of rotor blades grew louder. Searchlights pierced the smoke, cutting shafts of blinding white across the valley. The insurgents faltered, momentarily thrown by the sudden illumination. Gunships opened fire, miniguns roaring as streams of red tracers scythed through the enemy ranks. The valley lit up with explosions, bodies scattering under the torrent of fire. For the first time in hours, the tide broke, not because of their own dwindling firepower, but because salvation had arrived in the form of steel angels screaming across the sky. Kara staggered to her feet, chest heaving, blood dripping down her temple. She fired her last round into a retreating figure, then let the empty pistol drop from her hand. Around her, her brothers stood battered and broken but alive. Ramirez leaned heavily against a rock, his arms slick with blood, but his grin was feral. "Told you, Dalton," he rasped, "you keep buying us time and time brings the cavalry." The helicopters circled, hammering the valley floor with relentless fire. The insurgents scattered, their screams swallowed by the thunder of gunfire and rotor blades. The night that had seemed endless finally cracked open under the blaze of rescue. Yet even as the battle shifted, Kara's knees trembled, her body finally registering the toll. She had given everything, every ounce of strength to hold the line, and against all odds they had held. But as the first rescue bird descended toward their ridge, Kara's vision blurred. Her body swayed, her legs buckling beneath her. She felt hands catch her, Ramirez steady despite his own wounds. His voice was faint in her ears but steady. "Easy, Hawkeye. You did it. You kept us breathing. Just hold on a little longer." Her lips parted, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at them. She wanted to answer, to remind him that she had only done what she was meant to do. That she had promised she would hold the line. But the words never came. Her head slumped against his chest as exhaustion finally claimed her, even as the rescue bird's floodlights bathed them in salvation. The thump of rotor blades shook the night air, drowning out the echoes of gunfire that had ruled the ridge for so long. The rescue bird hovered overhead, side doors open, door gunners raining streams of fire down on the retreating insurgents. Dust and smoke whipped across the rock, washing over the battered SEALs like a storm. For the first time in hours, the battlefield was no longer a killing ground but a lifeline. Ramirez dragged Kara toward the rope dangling from the helicopter, his voice hoarse yet steady. "Move. Everyone up. We're leaving." The men responded with the last strength their broken bodies could muster. Givens stumbled forward, one arm hanging uselessly, but he gripped the rope with his good hand and began the climb. Myers had to be half carried by another teammate, his side soaked red, yet he refused to release his weapon until the moment his boots left the dirt. Each man was a shadow of himself, cut, bloodied, hollow-eyed, but they were still alive, still breathing, still together. And that alone was victory enough. Kara's world blurred at the edges, her limbs heavy as lead, every nerve screaming for rest. Yet when Ramirez tried to hoist her first, she shoved back, her voice sharp despite the weakness. "Not me. Get them out first." He glared at her, the look of a commander unwilling to argue yet knowing he couldn't waste time. He dragged another man to the rope instead, shoving him upward. Only when the last of the team had begun climbing did Kara finally allow Ramirez to tie her into the harness. She clung to the rope with trembling hands, the wind of the rotors tearing at her hair, and as the ground fell away, she dared one final glance at the valley below. The field of bodies, the smoking wreck of the Technical, the blood-stained rocks, they would haunt her forever. The helicopter surged skyward, banking hard as tracer rounds rose from below, streaks of angry light chasing them into the night. Door gunners fired back, the minigun's roar rattling her bones. Kara pressed her forehead against the cool metal of the harness, eyes closing, and for the first time in hours she let herself breathe. She had no memory of collapsing into the arms of a medic once they were pulled aboard, no memory of Ramirez shouting for triage. All she remembered was the bitter taste of gunpowder still clinging to her tongue, the smell of blood, and the knowledge that somehow, against impossible odds, they had endured. When she woke again, it was the antiseptic glow of a field hospital. White canvas flapped in the wind. A low murmur of pain filled the air. Kara blinked slowly, her throat dry, her body stiff with bandages. A shadow leaned over her, Ramirez, his arm bound, his face gaunt but alive. Relief flickered in his eyes when he saw her stir. "Welcome back, Hawkeye." She tried to speak, but only a rasp escaped her. He offered her a canteen and she drank greedily, the water cold against her cracked lips. When she could finally whisper, her first words were simple. "The team?" Ramirez's grin was weary but proud. "Alive. Hurt but alive. You bought us that. Don't think for a second it was luck." His voice grew harder, the weight of truth in it. 200 against 9, Dalton. "Do you know why we're still here? Because your rifle never missed. Because you didn't stop when the rest of us were bleeding out. You carried us through that night." Kara turned her face away, eyes burning. She didn't want to hear it. Didn't want the weight of praise. She saw the valley every time she closed her eyes, the faces of the men she had killed, the tide of bodies she had dropped. Precision had saved her brothers, but the toll of every shot still carved deep into her chest. She wasn't a hero. She was a weapon, nothing more. Yet Ramirez refused to let her bury herself in silence. "Don't you dare minimize what you did. Every one of us owes you our lives. That's not something you can brush aside." Days bled together in the field hospital. The SEALs healed slowly, their bodies stitched back together, though none of them would ever be the same. Myers lost too much blood and hovered near death for days before finally stabilizing. Given's arm was shattered beyond repair, ending his operational career. Others bore scars both visible and hidden. But the bond between them had only tightened. They had stood on the edge of annihilation together and clawed their way back. And at the center of that bond was Kara. Word of the battle spread like wildfire through the ranks. Stories twisted and grew, 9 SEALs against 200, holding out until reinforcements came. The name Hawkeye carried a new weight, whispered with awe in chow halls and briefing rooms. Some said she had dropped 100 men with her rifle alone. Others claimed she had shot the driver of the technical at 1,000 meters in pitch darkness. The numbers didn't matter. What mattered was the truth at the core. She had been the razor's edge between life and death, and without her, there would have been no survivors to tell the tale. Yet Kara herself avoided the stories. She refused interviews, brushed aside questions, and spent long hours staring at the desert horizon. For her, there was no glory in the memory, only the faces in her scope, the endless equation of death she had solved again and again. Her brothers were alive, yes, but she had paid for their survival with a piece of her soul she could never reclaim. Ramirez saw it in her eyes, the quiet weight she carried, and though he tried to reassure her, he knew it was hers alone to bear. And still, in the silence of the desert nights, when the wind rattled the canvas and sleep refused to come, Kara would reach out, close her hand as if wrapping it around the stock of her rifle, and whisper to herself the only truth that mattered. They had held the line. Dawn painted the camp in muted gold as Kara sat alone outside the medical tent, her arm in a sling, her body a map of bruises and bandages. She watched the horizon with the stillness of a hunter, though she no longer sought targets. She sought meaning or perhaps absolution. The wind carried whispers of her name, Hawkeye, the story already growing larger than the truth. She could hear them from across the compound, soldiers retelling the Ridge fight as though it were legend. Some called her a savior, others a machine of death, but none of them knew the price she paid every time she closed her eyes. Ramirez joined her quietly, lowering himself onto the bench with the stiffness of a man whose wounds had only begun to heal. He didn't speak at first, just watched the same horizon. Finally he said, "Command wants to see you." Kara didn't answer her. Ramirez continued, "They're already talking medals. Navy Cross, maybe more. They want to put a face on survival, something the brass can hold up and say, here's what a SEAL looks like. They'll want pictures, interviews, speeches." He turned to her, his eyes steady. "But you don't have to do any of it if you don't want to. You've already done more than enough." She exhaled slowly, the sound heavy with exhaustion. "I didn't fight for medals." Her voice was flat, stripped of any pride. "I fought because if I didn't, you'd all be dead." Ramirez nodded once, as though he had expected that answer. "That's exactly why you're the kind they'll never stop talking about." He clapped her good shoulder gently, then left her to the silence. When she finally entered the command tent hours later, the air shifted. I followed her. Posture perfect despite the pain stitched into her body. The commander read the report aloud. 200 insurgents engaged, 9 SEALs holding position for 6 hours, air support arriving just in time. Losses, 0. Impossible odds turned possible through discipline and one sniper's unrelenting accuracy. Every word made her stomach tighten. She wanted to interrupt, to remind them of the screams, the blood, the faces of men she would see in nightmares, but she remained silent. At the end, the commander looked up, his expression sharp but not unkind. "You understand, Dalton, this will be remembered. What you did out there isn't just survival, it's history." She gave a stiff nod. "With respect, sir, what I did out there was my job." The tent fell quiet. Then the commander leaned back, studying her with a soldier's eyes, not a politician's. "Maybe. But jobs don't make legends. People do." He dismissed her, but his words clung to her like smoke she couldn't wash away. That night, the team gathered around a dim fire at the edge of camp, their bodies broken but their spirits alive in a way none of them could explain. They spoke little, the silence between them more comforting than any words. Finally Myers broke it, his voice weak but certain. "We're here because of her. Don't care what anyone says, don't care about the brass. That's the truth." No one argued. Not even Kara. She stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in her tired eyes. Her brothers were alive, and that truth outweighed every nightmare that would follow. In the days that followed, reporters tried to breach the perimeter, hungry for the story. High-ranking officers stopped by their tent with rehearsed words of admiration. Even the president sent a message through channels. The legend of the ridge had grown too fast to contain, spreading across bases and into the public sphere. And at the center of it all was Kara, whether she wanted it or not. But in the quiet moments, away from the spotlight, the truth still gnawed at her. She would polish her rifle, checking the scope, the bolt, the barrel, even though it had already been cleaned. She whispered the names of her brothers under her breath, like a prayer. Ramirez watched her sometimes, worry etched into his features. He knew she wasn't the same, none of them were, but for Kara the weight was heavier. Her rifle hadn't just protected, it had condemned. Still, when command gave them new orders, redeployment, Kara didn't flinch. She strapped on her gear, checked her rifle, and walked into the dust with the others. If war demanded more of her, she would answer. Not because she sought glory, not because she believed in medals, but because when her brothers looked to her, she could not let them see hesitation. And so, the legend of Hawkeye grew. Soldiers in distant outposts whispered her name like a talisman. Recruits spoke of her as though she were myth. But in her heart, Kara carried only the memory of a ridge drenched in blood and the unyielding vow she had carved into herself that night. She would always hold the line. No matter the cost. The world beyond the desert did not wait long to claim her. Within weeks, Kara Dalton's name crossed oceans, whispered in military circles and shouted in newsrooms. The battle on the ridge had already become myth. The numbers swelling with each retelling, 9 against 200, 9 against 300, depending on who spoke. Newspapers splashed her photo across front pages, calling her the Angel of Death, or the Guardian Sniper. Television anchors spoke her codename, Hawkeye, with reverence, spinning her silence into mystique. She became a symbol before she had even left the battlefield, and symbols, she realized, were far harder to kill than men. When the team rotated back to the States, the chaos followed them. Reporters hounded the airfield, cameras flashing, questions shouted. Kara kept her head down, sunglasses hiding her eyes, her uniform immaculate, but the attention pressed against her like a physical weight. Ramirez walked beside her, fielding questions with sharp dismissals, but even his authority could not fight the storm. "Is it true you killed over 100 insurgents? Do you think you're a hero? How does it feel to be the deadliest woman in American history?" She answered none of them. Silence became her shield, as effective as body armor. In Washington, the ceremony was unavoidable. The Navy Cross was placed in her hands by men in tailored suits who had never set foot on a battlefield. They spoke of courage, of sacrifice, of American resolve. Applause filled the hall, yet to Kara it was hollow, the sound echoing in her skull like gunfire in an empty room. She accepted the medal because refusing would dishonor her brothers, but inside, the weight of it was unbearable. She had carried their lives on that ridge. Now she carried their story, distorted and polished for public consumption. Afterward, she sat in the medal still in its box, unopened. Ramirez found her there, a glass of water in his hand. "You did good," he said softly. "You gave them what they wanted." Her jaw tightened. "What they wanted isn't the truth." He shrugged. "Truth doesn't sell. But listen, what matters isn't what they say on the news. What matters is that we're here. That night didn't end with 9 flag-draped coffins. Don't lose sight of that. She nodded, though her chest ached with conflict. To the world, she was a symbol of unbreakable precision. To herself, she was the woman who had stared through a scope at human lives and ended them without pause, because hesitation meant death for her brothers. Both versions were true, but only one was celebrated. Back home, life was no kinder. Strangers recognized her in grocery stores, asking for selfies, thanking her for her service with wide, awed eyes. Veterans approached her with solemn respect, calling her ma'am, as though she were already legend. But at night, in the silence of her apartment, she sat alone, the rifle she no longer fired resting in the corner. Her walls held no medals, no framed photographs. Only shadows. The nightmares never gave her peace. She woke drenched in sweat, hearing the echo of bullets, seeing the ridge painted red. Sometimes she reached for the rifle in her sleep, her hands forming the motion of a shot. Other nights, she saw the faces of the men she had killed, faceless yet heavy with accusation. Therapy was offered, counselors spoke of trauma and coping mechanisms, but Kara listened in silence, nodding, never truly letting them inside. How could they understand? She had not just survived war, she had defined it. The Navy, however, understood enough to know she was valuable. They wanted her to train recruits, to lecture at sniper schools, to shape the next generation of marksmen. She accepted because training gave her structure, and structure was survival. Standing before wide-eyed rookies, she demonstrated techniques with cold precision, her voice steady, her movements exact. They watched her as though she were untouchable, as though greatness might be absorbed simply by standing in her shadow. She corrected their stances, adjusted their grips, but never spoke of the ridge. The legend was theirs to believe. The truth was hers to endure. Yet even in that role, the war found her again. A mission arose, high risk, and command insisted she was the only one with the skill to make it succeed. Ramirez came to her with the orders. "Slow. You don't have to do this. After what you gave, they shouldn't be asking." Kara looked at him with tired eyes. "I'll always have to do this. You know that." He didn't argue because he knew she was right. For Kara Dalton, there would never be peace. Legends were not allowed rest. Legends were forged in fire, and fire demanded fuel. That night, as she cleaned her rifle under a single lamp's glow, she whispered the same vow she had carried from the ridge. "I will hold the line. Always." The plane that carried her back across the ocean was quiet, filled with men and women who bore the same look, haunted eyes, stiff postures, a silence too heavy for conversation. Kara sat near the window, her rifle case strapped beside her, hands folded neatly in her lap. Outside, the clouds stretched endless and pale, but inside her chest, a storm still raged. She had gone when ordered, pulled the trigger again, and the mission had been deemed a success. Another name for the record books, another headline for those who wanted her story polished into something clean. Yet to her, it was only another night she would never escape. When the plane landed, Ramirez was waiting. His arm was healed enough for him to return to duty, though his eyes carried the same exhaustion she knew lived in her own. He walked beside her through the terminal, their silence a kind of comfort. Finally he said, "They're not going to stop. You know that, right? You're Hawkeye now. That's bigger than Kara Dalton. Bigger than me, bigger than all of us." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She already knew. Her life had been claimed by something beyond her control, a legend that would not die even if she wished it. The weeks that followed were a blur of ceremonies and briefings. Command praised her. Politicians spoke her name with practiced reverence. Journalists begged for interviews she would never give. But when the noise faded and the cameras left, she returned each night to the solitude of her apartment, where the walls pressed close and the silence screamed. Her medal sat unopened on the kitchen counter. Dust gathered on the box. One evening, Ramirez visited unannounced, 2 beers in hand. He set one in front of her and sat down across the table. They drank in silence until finally he asked, "Do you regret it?" "The ridge." Kara's eyes lifted, hard and distant. "I regret that it had to happen. But regret doesn't change what I did. What I had to do." He nodded slowly. "That's the only answer that makes sense." He studied her, his expression unreadable. "You know, every guy on that ridge would be dead if it weren't for you. You can carry the nightmares if you want, but don't you dare forget that truth. We're alive because of you." She looked away, her throat tight. She wanted to believe it, wanted to let his words anchor her. But she had seen too much. She carried both the salvation and the destruction, and the line between them blurred every time she tried to find it. The Navy eventually gave her what she thought she wanted, an honorable discharge. They framed it as respect, a recognition of service beyond measure, but Kara knew the truth. Legends were useful in war, but in peace they became ghosts. And ghosts made people uneasy. Civilian life was a strange battlefield. Strange, but she drifted through the world unseen in other ways. She worked odd jobs, lived simply, avoided the spotlight. At night, she still woke with her hands curled as though gripping a rifle, her breath sharp, her heart racing. Therapy helped some, but the scars never truly healed. She learned to live with them the way a soldier learns to live with a limp or a missing finger. Pain is part of survival. One spring morning years later, she found herself standing at Arlington, the rows of white stones stretching like an army in silence. She had come alone, carrying no flowers, only memories. Ramirez's stone stood among them, his name etched in marble. He had gone back to war when she would not, and the war had taken him in the end. Kara rested her hand on the stone, her fingers tracing the letters. "They'll tell stories about us," she whispered. "But only you and I will ever know what it really cost." The wind stirred, carrying the faint sound of distant traffic, the hum of a world that moved on. She closed her eyes and for a moment she was back on the ridge, the screams, the gunfire, the weight of her rifle in her hands. But when she opened them again, the world was still, the grass swaying gently. Kara turned away, her steps steady. She would never escape the legend that had claimed her, but she had made peace with one truth: she had held the line. Against impossible odds, against the storm of death, she had stood her ground. Her brothers had lived because she refused to falter. That was the truth beneath the myths, the heartbeat beneath the headlines. And though the world would remember Hawkeye as a hero, Kara Dalton carried a soldier who refused to let go, and a woman who would forever bear the weight of the night the world called victory. The end.